All right, y'all. Welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News, a bi-weekly editorial geopolitical show hosted by myself, Greg Stoker. And because English is a weird mutt of a language, bi-weekly can mean either twice a week or once every other week. In this case, we mean twice a week. Monday and Thursdays or Fridays. We're still seeing what day is best, Thursday or Friday. So that's still up in the air. You can comment below which you think would work better for you. So tonight, we're not going to get into a whole lot of news, breaking news, but actually, wait. I'm going to do the Patreon plug real quick while everybody's still filtering in. So hold on to your butts. Mint Press is an independent newsroom and doesn't have any corporate sponsors. Mint Press has been banned from PayPal. Fundraisers have been taken down by GoFundMe and demonetized on YouTube. If you'd like to support this brand of independent journalism, consider dropping your Economist subscription and slanging $5 a month this way. It does go a long way to support independent watchdog journalism. If not, I get it. We are, after all, getting nickeled and dimed to death in contemporary society. We're just glad you're here. So that's over with. Live from wherever I am. It's Friday night and we're doing this. So where were we? Tonight, we're not going to get into a whole lot of news, as I was saying. But to knock out a few bullet points before the weekend, let's say first, efforts to secure a Gaza ceasefire and hostage release have gained momentum. Hamas makes revised proposal on ceasefire deal. Israel says negotiations to continue next week. Hamas rules out any foreign troop presence in Gaza. Remember the whole Arab coalition thing that Netanyahu was floating? They're not going to agree to that. And then Hamas briefs the Lebanese ally Hezbollah on the latest details. So nothing's going to happen this weekend. The process is going to continue into next week. So more on that next week. The regional situation is probably going to remain stable over the weekend as well. And the Lebanon war doesn't look like it's going to happen. So second, Biden is doubling down and the DNC is backing him. I would rather not report on that if it's all the same to you guys, because it's kind of depressing. And third, this ties into what we're talking about tonight, think tanks. Here we go. So first off, yesterday on the 4th, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has said his troops have seized the key town of Marinka in eastern Ukraine. So he told President Vladimir Putin assault units had taken, quote, the powerful fortified area just outside of Donetsk, a Russian-held regional capital. So they certainly seem, the Russians that is, to have the initiative right now, and that looks unlikely to change. However, the West won't back down, and Russia doesn't really need to compromise right now. So this looks like it will eventually turn into a frozen conflict involving a very profitable contractor demilitarized zone, probably somewhere in the Donbass. So first off, I just want to say, not a fan of Russian military actions. Obviously, I think the Wagner Group is one of the most loathsome organizations out there, doing some dirty work in Sudan and just about everywhere else. And they've got their own Nazi problem. But tonight isn't really about Russia. It's about our side of the street here in the West. We have an undeniable war machine that exports violence around the globe, and we have an entire media and academic apparatus that covers for it and legitimizes it. So you guys may have heard about the MIMAC, the MIC, the military industrial complex. You know how defense contractors lobby politicians, politicians get out of office to work for defense contractors, then go back into public office. And it's this revolving door that influences policy where corporations that export weapons and spyware basically influence U.S. foreign policy. Well, I think it's kind of incomplete, and I'm not the only one who says this. It's not the MIC, it's really the MIMAC, which is the military, industrial, media, and academic complex. So the M is the media, and the academic is A. So when we talk about, obviously, because everyone here is smart, but we know what the media is, right? I think a lot of people are just waking up to a lot of this stuff. I'm sure a lot of you guys were aware of it before, but the media creates and manufactures consent. It covers for actions of the West, and I'm just speaking about Western media right now. I'm not speaking about everybody else. And basically engineers the public to accept foreign wars and foreign aid and this massive amount of tax money that's being taken out of the public sector, put into the private sector in the name of the defense industrial complex. So that's the media. Now there's an academic side. This comes in the form of like college doctrine, types of education and what's being taught in schools, but it's really also about think tanks. So tonight is going to be about, because everyone knows about the media, we're going to talk about one of the academic aspects of this entire war apparatus, and that is think tanks. So we're just going to dive right in, and we're going to use the conflict in Russia and Ukraine to really hone in on how the West has primed this narrative where when Russia invaded the Donbass, it was just like October 7th, and that whatever happened before was ahistorical. It did not exist in the historical record. Russia just attacked out of nowhere because that's what Russians do. That was kind of the mobilizing that old Cold War era thinking. And it's not a completely good corollary. I don't think it is between like that and October 7th, because one country is under illegal occupation and one is not. However, we can see the same trend. Before October 7th, there was no history, and that's manufactured. And so consent for war, where you have a clear victim, Israel or Ukraine, I'm not making a perfect corollary. It's the same techniques. And a lot of that is through the media and also through think tanks. So what are think tanks? Well, a lot of people are starting to learn about this stuff. So this is a good primer episode. And we're just going to send it. It's Friday night. Let's not sand on ceremony. I'll be posting links in the comments and responding to questions. And then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A afterward. Cheers, y'all. And so begins tonight's segment, think tanks. All right. Think tanks have a benign dictionary definition, an organization that gathers groups of interdisciplinary scholars to perform research around particular policies, issues, ideas ranging from social policy to culture and technology. However, the great unspoken negative aspect of think tanks is the power that they wield. They control information, shape and legitimize government policy, serve as a waiting room for politicians who are not currently in office, for when they get back into politics and they kind of bounce back and forth. And their established business model sells political influence in Washington and manufactures consent amongst the voting public. The military-industrial complex, a voraciously for-profit industry, is the primary donor for many leading think tanks, which engenders a bias towards military solutions and the perpetuation of global war. So tonight on State of Play, we examine the hawkish world of prominent think tanks within the context of the defense industry and the war in Ukraine. How do they function? How have they influenced U.S. policies towards Russia? So, as you know, even the slightest amount of Cold War history, Russia is a primary geostrategic adversary of Western global hegemony and has been used as a perennial boogeyman both during and after the fall of the USSR to justify exorbitant defense spending by Washington. Think tanks, therefore, have an overriding profit incentive to push for a belligerent posture towards Russia, as they are inextricably joined to an industry where the war or the possibility of war is profitable and peace fails to produce attractive quarterly returns. So let us take the Rand Corporation as a case study. According to their About page, the RAND Corporation, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and present that later. Okay. The RAND Corporation, according to them, is a research organization that develops solutions to public policy challenges to help make communities throughout the world safer and more secure, healthier, and more prosperous. They're good guys. They're good guys. However, even a cursory examination of the 2023 fiscal year revenue casts serious doubt on their self-proclaimed objective analysis. Over $43 million from the U.S. Army, $50 million from the U.S. Air Force, and $68.9 million from the U.S. Secretary of Defense and other national security agencies. That's what they get. There is an inescapable nexus between think tanks, governments, and the military-industrial complex. The military, the intelligence community, and various governmental departments sponsor think tanks, which in turn advise those same institutions with confrontational policy stances. The advisory product of these think tanks is then used to legitimize hawkish policy and the funding of defense contracts to the government or by the government. Research and development contracts for the next generation of weapons and deterrence, which may never even be used beyond existing theoretically as deterrents, are the most stable and reliable sources of income for the military industrial complex. The amount of public money flowing into defense research and development dwarfs the amount spent on other prominent innovation policy tools in the United States. And as long as a convenient and established boogeyman exists, consent for armed belligerents can be easily manufactured. So in 2019, the RAND Corporation released a report titled Overextending and Unbalancing Russia, linked in the comments, espousing the U.S. goal to undermine Russia just as it did the USSR during the Cold War. It is easy to condemn Russian military action in Ukraine, but one must also recognize a bellicose Western foreign policy that bulldozed over very public Russian diplomatic and military red lines. You will never hear those in the Western corporate media. So consent and legitimacy for the ongoing proxy war in Ukraine is manufactured and legitimized by media and think tanks, portraying the West as all good and Russia as all bad. The truth, however, exists in the gray and is inextricably linked to profit motive. So in order to help us get into this whole subject, we are joined by Alina Xenofontos, an international law and globalization specialist. She's worked as a researcher in international EU policy with special focus on financial and corporate crime. Most of her work is centered on geopolitical analysis of policy and the economic underpinning of EU foreign policy objectives. So she has worked with organizations such as SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations based in the Netherlands, and has spent many years in think tank world. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Greg.
All right. So think tank world, before we get into it, I've said a bunch of things that think tanks are funded and enable special interests, influence policy, and are inextricably linked to the private sector and defense complex. They're also connected sometimes to intelligence agencies and our public fronts or cutouts for those intelligence agencies. So before we get into that, I would like to play a propaganda piece about, how nice and how good and how benign and benevolent think tanks really are. And then we'll hop right in.
What is a think tank?
Let's do it.
What is a think tank?
Okay.
A think tank, this is a very good question.
A think tank tries to bring in fresh, evidence-based ideas into the policymaking process.
A think tank is an institution that tries to bridge research and policy.
There are now something like 4,000 think tanks in the world. A think tank is not a university, it's not a research institute, and it's not an NGO advocacy organization either.
Think tanks play this really crucial role of asking questions that can be answered with empirical information and analyses about key policy issues.
They're all doing research to try and improve society in some way and influence policymakers, decision makers, and hopefully the general public.
Think tanks start with a very simple premise. Ideas matter, and those that are carelessly executed and recklessly conceived can have dire consequences.
Think tanks matter because they infuse the public debate with analysis that is based on research and not opinion.
They can convene different policy actors. They can build capacities of policy analysts, of policy makers, of civil society actors and journalists. They can also provide legitimacy to policies by supporting them with evidence, with information, with advice.
The work that think tanks are doing is crucial. I can't imagine a world without think tanks, really.
The reason we do this is not just because we like sitting in cloistered buildings having interesting conversations, but because we can see that the world is changing really fast and that our job is to help shape progress for the future so that everybody benefits.
On thinktanks.org. All right. So initial response to that.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, honestly, my first response was how infantilizing the whole thing is, with the sort of childlike music and the little animated sound, like little sounds at the back as well, as if they're trying to infantilize the public essentially, and show us that think tanks are such a good thing. It sort of reminds me of when you're in primary school and they tell you to write the pros and cons of something, and then you have to provide this very basic little outline of the pros of, I don't know, like the use of the internet. It just seemed very, very juvenile, but and very demoralizing to the audience. That was my interpretation of the video. Now, as to the content of what it is, as to what they actually said, well, I mean, yeah. In addition to what you said in your intro, think tanks for the most part are sort of compromised institutions that masquerade themselves as being intellectually neutral, but they are predominantly funded by state actors and private actors, which essentially constitutes as a form of legalized bribery. And these institutions then are meant to produce information dependently, even though they're funded in the millions by the private sector and by the state.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So
yeah,
yeah,
it's a bit more complicated than the video suggests.
Oh, absolutely. I think we should look at the Rand Corporation, which we brought up in the intro, just based off of their funding. Okay, so we got how we're funded. This is based off their website. Rand is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Our research is sponsored by U.S. government agencies, state and local government, non-U.S. government agencies, ministries, international organizations, colleges, universities, foundations. In addition, et cetera, we also rely on philanthropic support. But if we look at revenue, we've got 68.9 million from the SecDef, National Security State, U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force. And the reason I like to bring up the Rand Corporation is because it's one of the most prominent think tanks, especially when it comes to global security and geopolitics. It's because when I was in special operations and when I was reading like intelligence product, the Rand Corporation was often cited. They are inextricably linked to advising policy on the global war on terror that supposedly no longer exists, and the Russia-Ukraine war that's currently going on. They've also written product on, they have an entire Eurasian desk, which advises on like the current crisis flashpoint in Taiwan. So yeah, they're everywhere. And they're a massive force within the US government and the policy movers and shakers in Washington.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, look at this. I mean, if we look at the funding right now, 3/4 almost of the funding that they receive, this is the average revenue for 2023, if I'm not mistaken, or 2022, 390 million. That's not including their net assets overall. That's when they're worth in the millions. And so you've got all these US state agencies, the CIA would be included, all these intelligence, the Pentagon, and they are essentially funding this institution. And then likewise, this institution that is publicizing policy papers that are supposed to be independently researched papers that are supposed to provide an objective analysis, but it becomes problematic from the point that obviously the vast majority of your funding comes from a state, and a state that has its own agenda.
Absolutely. And, if, we go through it, it's not all war related. So like think tanks do for the interests of wholeness. They do reports on social issues, rise of homelessness, that's a big thing in LA right now. But then again, they still write position papers on sustaining Western institutions like NATO, 75 years of RAND insights, unlocking Alaska's critical minerals development potential. So a tabletop exercise explored the opportunities and barriers to possible critical mineral developments in Alaska. Participants considered supply chains, local community impacts, and opportunities, infrastructure, finance, and the regulatory environment.
Yeah, but this is the thing. So these sort of think tanks, they're predominantly funded by the US, but they're predominantly funded by certain ideology. And that is sort of the free market capitalist ideology, let's just put it in like the most simple terms possible. So when you have these sorts of institutions, even when they're trying to address social issues, whether it's homelessness or environmental issues and environmental catastrophes, it's innately problematic because the root cause of homelessness and the root cause of environmental issues stem from the monopolized capital of the elite ruling class, and it's the elite ruling class that is funding them. So it becomes almost contradictory to expect these sort of think tanks to produce actually legitimate information or research papers that are actually going to counter the very system that funds them in the first place. And so what they actually do is, the way I see it, is that they try to almost prettify like these particular issues. They try to prettify these issues and therefore create almost a delusion, so that the masses actually believe that they are essentially intelligence organizations or institutions rather that are geared towards bettering the world, when in reality what they're doing is trying to provide intelligence on a very superficial level to address homelessness without actually addressing the problem, but deluding the masses into believing that they are attempting to address the problems of capitalism that have led to these issues.
Yeah, and one of the big parts about think tanks is they add a certain gravitas, a sort of like academic rigor that the mass media, the corporate and legacy media, doesn't provide, because they've been endowed and invested with this kind of scholastic pedigree. So think tanks as a medium for manufacturing consent is a big thing, because they manufacture consent for even the ruling class, right? Because the policymakers in Washington, the basic premise of think tanks is they think in some ways and research for policymakers, because policymakers, as the logic goes, don't have the time or capacity to be experts on every issue. So they go to these think tanks. The think tanks are backed by certain corporations and special interests. They create a product that is consumed by policymakers, and that is consumed by an entire group of or class of people, and that is how policy is colored. So it's actually very influential on decision-making processes. And then other news outlets will cite think tanks as a way to establish more bona fides for whatever argument that like CNN pundits are making, etc. So yes, it does. It's kind of more of an elitist sphere for what I would say is the MIMAC, the military industrial media and academic complex. So all of these manufacture consent for these interests, and think tanks are like the academic aspect of what we would call the MIMAC.
Yeah, exactly. So we spoke about manufacturing consent. Another way to put it is sort of cultural hegemony. So what they do is like they're tools of cultural hegemony. And cultural hegemony is essentially all the different mediums by which the state or those in power essentially use in order to propagate certain information to the masses, so that the public, the general public, can actually believe that their self-interests align with the self-interest of the elite class. So that in that way, what they're doing is they're not just manufacturing consent, but it's sort of consent to be controlled at the same time, to have the policymakers in place carry out policies that are actually at the disadvantage of the people that are supposed to serve, but actually to benefit the ruling class. But sort of think tanks like this, the way that they present information as well, will make you think essentially that they're serving the interest of the overall public. So one of their apart from the fact that they manufacture consent for government policies, it's also consent to be controlled and to be completely subjugated. And this is just one aspect of all the different mediums that states use in order to essentially pacify as well a population.
So yeah, I guess now we should make this a practical exercise. So I definitely did want, because think tanks have been so instrumental and influencing public perception of, the war in Ukraine. It's just like kind of, there's a corollary, because when the war in Ukraine broke out, it was kind of like an October 7th situation. Russia invaded, boom, done, completely hostile. No history existed before that. Kind of like October 7th, Hamas broke the gates, committed war crimes, no history before that. Now, you can not be an apologist for Russian military action and still recognize that there was a whole lot of history and there was a whole lot of diplomatic things that happened before the Russia invasion of the Donbass region a couple years ago. And so I just remember this massive media push that basically only focus on the Russian side of things about Putin wanting to revitalize this vision of a faded USR of an empire and stuff. But it didn't acknowledge any of the United States or NATO moves that happened before that. And so, I think you've prepared some product to go through that.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay. So let's go. I don't know if you want to pull out as well I sent you a report, I think by the Rand Corporation. It was published in 2019, labeled Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. I don't know if you want to present that. I think it's a good little point to sort of take off from. But yeah, in 2019, the Rand report published its own research paper, essentially called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. And the entire report was premised on the idea of exploiting Russia's anxieties, as they called them. And these anxieties are obviously rooted in its own history, where at least 3 times in the last 200 years, Europeans have tried to invade Russia and take over and conquer Russia. And the last, obviously, being during World War II, when Hitler used Ukraine specifically to invade Russia and pretty much almost brought about the death of 30 million Russians. So the objective was to force Russia to extend itself, as it did during the Cold War in Afghanistan. So what the idea was that Russia would then enter Ukraine, but to use up all its resources and destroy its own economy by investing in a military project in Ukraine that it wouldn't be able to win, in order to weaken the Russian economy so extensively, so as to eliminate Russia as an adversary and a competitor to the United States. And if that's what it means by overextending and unbalancing, so stretching Russia so thin that it would basically self-destruct. And that's exactly the same sort of Cold War era ideology that occurred that they actually executed with Afghanistan. I mean, one of the ways in which they did that is that we know that the United States, even Hillary Clinton, had overtly stated herself how there was the funding of Al-Qaeda and the creation of Al-Qaeda, the Mujahideen, and part of that process was to fund these organizations in order to bring Russia into war in Afghanistan and therefore deplete it. And they sort of were trying to do exactly the same thing. And in fact, the Rand Corporation was sort of boasting in this report that they were the ones that facilitated the idea of bringing Russia into Afghanistan, and now they're basically propagating the same sort of narrative and the same sort of ideology. And if you go down into the report, it actually even highlights mediums by which to coerce Russia into a war. And they speak specifically, obviously, about the provocation via Ukraine, providing Ukraine with lethal weapons, NATO drills on Russia's borders, deploying tactical nuclear weapons around Russia, withdrawing from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, so the INF, which they did, increasing U.S. force operations in the Black Sea. And this report came out in 2019. And if you look at sort of the US approach since 2019 onwards, they actually did, and actually not even 2019, from 2014, this is exactly what the United States did. And I mean, it was actually in 2021 where they even carried out a NATO sort of drill against Russia, which was called Defender 2021. And then from 2019 onwards, I think approximately 1 billion in lethal aid, aka weapons, were provided to Ukraine, and all of this was done for the purpose of antagonizing Russia when they knew full well that Russia had this, as they call it in their own article, anxieties about obviously having a NATO, which, by the way, NATO was created in order to counter the Warsaw Pact, which was, you know, the military alliance of the former socialist countries. So the whole premise of NATO was to counter Russia from the get-go, and to have this sort of military organization build up around you, encircling Russia and trying to intimidate Russia, was one of the means by which they were planning on weakening Russia. And then some other suggestions were sanctioning Russia in order to destroy its economy, deplete Russia. And as we've seen from 2014 onwards, that's exactly what happened.
Well, yeah, you know, it says explicitly right here, the work builds on the concept of long-term strategic competition developed during the Cold War, some of which originated at RAND.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very proud of that. They reiterate, if you read the whole report, they reiterate this point multiple times, that they were the ones that initiated the sort of the depletion of Russia through Afghanistan. So it's something, and actually, if you go down, I think if you go just a little bit further down.
Yeah, just real quick. I just want to show the audience this. Economic cost imposing measures, imposing deeper trade and financial sanctions, increasing Europe's ability to import gas from suppliers other than Russia, encouraging the emigration from Russia of skilled labor and well-educated youth. So enforcing a brain drain.
Brain drain, yeah.
And so we have an entire likelihood of success in extending Russia. Benefits high, costs, risks low. So yeah, they've done a whole cost risk analysis about how much they can calibrate these sanctions before Russia is antagonized.
Impose deeper trade sanctions. And then if you go underneath, it says even about how lethalizing Ukraine, and then they're analyzing the likelihood of, providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And then here underneath, you have the little graph, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. So likelihood of success is moderate, but the benefits are high. The costs and the risks in this case are high, but they were willing to do it if absolutely necessary.
Increased support to Syrian rebels. Likelihood of success low, benefits moderate, costs and risk high. So yeah, all right. This is their proxy war against Russian influence in the Middle East during the Syrian civil war. Promote the liberalization of Belarus, expand ties to the South Caucasus. So that's Georgia. You see, it's right there.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not. I mean, sometimes when you have these conversations with people, it almost sounds conspiracy theory, but no, it's actually on their pages is the reports that are published by them. And then when you look at the fact that obviously they're funded by the U.S. State Department, by the U.S. intelligence agents, by the vast majority of the funding comes from these institutions. This is the kind, I mean, they're basically creating, intellectualizing arguments by which to justify warfare, by which to justify a second Cold War. That could easily, I think this particular Cold War is far more significant and far more dangerous than the former Cold War. And this think tank is basically not just justifying it, but like we said, it's manufacturing consent among the masses for it.
Yeah, and now we see us doing the same thing that we accuse Russia of. Diminished faith in the Russian electoral system. Low, benefits moderate, costs and risks high. Yes, being exposed and subverting elections is very high risk, especially if you're the global exporter of democracy. Encourage domestic protests and other nonviolent resistance. So undermine Russia's image abroad. This is all moderates across the board. So
And it influences people's opinion. The average layman, like if you have a conversation with somebody who's essentially grows up and lives in the West, their interpretation of Russia is this autocratic state where nobody expresses an opinion and nobody can articulate condemnation of the state. And of course, that's not true. I mean, Russia is a complex country like any other country that has internalized strife, and people have debates, whether it's online debates or television shows where they discuss their political, their own political discourse and hardships. But the reason people have these opinions, let's just say, and it's not just about Russia, but any adversary, whether it's Iran, whether it's China, whoever, is because the idea of as in the Russian state as a democracy has been completely destroyed by Western think tanks that actually generate this narrative, which is a mendacious narrative that essentially, there is no public discourse and everything is autocratic, and it's this horrendous country that is not open to dialogue, and it's not completely the truth.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the Rand Corporation. It's honestly the one I have the most experience with, coming from the military, but it's a huge thing. Now I see it in the show notes. We have the revolving door issue between these think tanks and public service positions.
Yeah. So, I mean, even if you look at the board of trustees for the Rand Corporation, you have someone called Karen Elliott House. She's a former publisher for the Wall Street Journal. And this is actually very common, where you have publishers of mainstream media outlets who have also worked and are, trustees or senior fellows of these these think tanks. And so,
you could say, you could also call them intelligence cutouts too. Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you.
Essentially what they are, right?
Yeah.
So you have on the one hand, they're supposed to be journalists, because and from a perspective of a journalistic institution, or as a journalist, you have an obligation to be able to essentially counter the narrative of the state or question the state and sort of seek the truth. I mean, we know that's not what essentially happens, because they're also compromised through their own sort of funding mechanisms. But then you have these individuals who are sort of alternating between working in think tanks that themselves publish intelligence reports for the purpose of promoting the agenda of the state, or rather the ruling class, to be more accurate. And at the same time, they're fluctuating between that and working as journalists or as publishers for mainstream media outlet like the Wall Street Journal. I think another board of trustee is Richard Danzig. He was a former U.S. Secretary of the Navy. Then you have Chuck Hagel, which was former U.S. Secretary of Defense, these are all board of trustees of the Rand Corporation. So you can see how deeply embedded the state is with these independent think tanks, as well as with the mainstream media outlets. And so what we have we have the state, which sort of represents the ruling class, and then we have these mechanisms by which they essentially control information, and they do so in a way to delude people into accepting a narrative that serves the interests of the ruling class at their own expense. And this is why the issue of the revolving door is such a significant one.
Yeah.
And I would like to move on to the Brookings Institute, because that's
that's the getting into the Brookings Institute with like Robert Kagan and Victoria Nuland. That's So let's do it.
That's an interesting one. So, I mean, okay, the Brookings Institute, I don't know if you want to take out their revenues, but I think their net revenue, if I remember correctly, was at 119 million. I could be wrong. On just this year alone. Again, I mean, when you look at their largest contributors, you obviously have parts of the U.S. state, intelligence agencies, etc., the same sort of individuals. But then you also have Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You have J.P. Morgan, State of Qatar, which we're going to get into, is one of the biggest donors to the Brookings Institute, and we're going to talk about that. But discussing the construct of revolving doors, one of the co-founders, or rather no, one of the senior fellows of the Brookings Institute is actually Robert Kagan. And just in case people don't know, so Robert Kagan was also the co-founder of the neoconservative think tank Project for the New American Century. And now the Project for the New American Century does not exist anymore. However, it was very predominant in the 2000s. And the Project for the New American Century was, their philosophy, let's say, was to promote and advocate for U.S. hegemony. And it was a very interventionist think tank, and it was again premised on the idea of American leadership is good for the world. So the entire planet needs the Americans to lead the world, because the rest of us aren't able to lead ourselves. And I think it was many of the members of this particular think tank, the Project for the New American Century, then went on in the 2000s to join the Bush administration. And when I'm speaking about these members are rather prominent individuals. So we've got Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and these were some of the principal orchestrators of the Iraq War. And if we remember the famous sort of quote by Donald Rumsfeld, the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence in order to justify a brutal war. You remember, it was amazing. Yeah, the absence of evidence is not the evidence. What you actually want to invoke Article 51 with no evidence whatsoever. And obviously, we know the impacts that the Iraq War had on Iraq and how many people were killed, over 1 million. And these members, these individuals, like the Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, they were part of this project. And Robert Kagan himself was a very pro-war advocate. He, like we said, and he's now a fellow at the Brookings Institute. And this person, by the way, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institute, also, I think, has written extensive pieces for the New York Times, again, advocating for war. So this is a very war hawk individual. But it gets even more interesting with him, and we can discuss this together. But Robert Kagan is also the husband of Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. And she has had a very prominent role in the war between Russia and Ukraine. But, we can get into that if you like.
We could definitely. I think the fact that Victoria Nuland is connected to the Brookings Institute, which advises on U.S. foreign policy, when she was such a war hawk when it comes to the war in Ukraine, having that marital connection to the Brookings, to a co-founder, a contributor of the Brookings,
he's a
senior
fellow of the Brookings Institute. Yeah, and he's the husband of Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland, who herself, we have the leak audio, and you can even find the leak audio on BBC, who has a whole transcript discussing with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine how essentially there was going to be a sort of coup operation where they were going to decide and dictate, and they had already decided who was going to take power in Ukraine. And she has been a big part of the policy that the U.S. has in Ukraine. And her husband is part of the Brookings Institute. This is a huge conflict of interest at the very least. That's just putting it mildly.
Yeah. And so when we talk about, when you see all these marital connections, these interconnections, the revolving door between the political and the private, the private and the public sector, this is what we talk about when we talk about like a ruling political, or like a political and corporate elite. And think tanks are a main driving force in that world for, again, legitimacy and for the manufacturing of consent for what this small group of people wants to do with the world. And so
exactly.
Yeah. And then we've got the Atlantic Council, often referred to as the NATO think tank. And this is, again, sometimes gets pretty hawkish. It's been accused, I'd say rightly so, of being a straight up intelligence cutout. And, you hear it espouse the same Cold War era talking points that we grew up hearing. So if you go straight to their website and you pull up like the About page, and they have a bunch of different regional desks for different parts of the world. So let's look at the Eurasia Center from the Atlantic Council. So the Eurasia Center's mission is to promote policies that encourage stability, democratic values, and prosperity in Eurasia. A democratic, prosperous, and stable Eurasia is a core interest for the United States and plays into the Atlantic Council's focus on great power competition. So for the Eurasia Center, the year 2021 was marked by dramatic changes that brought renewed urgency to its mission. Ukraine faced serious challenges both internally within its domestic reform agenda and externally as Russia's war threatened to escalate to dramatic new heights. So you have the same kind of language. It kind of espouses the same democratic pro-Western values that we came to kind of start to become disillusioned with during the Iraq and Afghan war. But it doesn't really take a lot to parse through what their real intent is at all.
No, and I mean, if you still go on their page, they advocate that their main ideology is Atlanticism. So the idea of, again, this is why it's called that. If you go like Atlanticism, the whole EU Europe domination, and obviously they even have the flags of NATO, and actually as well. The Atlantic Council very often organizes meetings between top NATO officials and top state officials, whether it be from Ukraine even or wherever else in the world. So here you have a think tank that's supposed to be, again, an intellectual group of people who are sort of supposed to be taking epistemological approach to their research and providing people with accurate and informed information that to inform people to make better decisions, etc., and to hold the state accountable. And they are actually putting together meetings between the NATO officials and other government officials to do what exactly? So it really highlights the agenda behind the Atlantic Council, which is essentially the sort of intelligence branch of NATO and the state.
Yeah. So the NATO Washington Summit. During this historic year for the alliance, the Atlantic Council is leading the charge in shaping the agenda for the Washington Summit, informing the transatlantic community and demonstrating NATO's enduring value. So yes, it is a. So we're kind of getting low on time. So just it is a vehicle for policy making, but it is also, and we kind of wanted to end on this, think tanks as a business model.
Yeah. So, I mean, so beyond the fact, all right, so you got think tanks. They're obviously, like we said, they're tools of cultural hegemony, and they actually create the perfect scenario in order to sustain the status quo. But in addition to that, it's because they're nonprofit organizations, they're tax exempt, but also they're essentially what's the word that I'm going for? They're tax deductible, which essentially means for all those who actually invest or rather provide donations to these think tanks, the donations that they basically provide are tax deductible, which allows for them to use these think tanks as a means by which to essentially avoid or rather carry out tax evasion. Because what happens is that essentially the state subsidizes these donors by exempting them from paying certain tax if they donate to these organizations. So it's also a smart way for multinational corporations, whether you're Bill Gates, and I mean, Bill Gates spends an average, or I think something like $6 billion to, funding think tanks all around the world for his own, obviously, agenda. Let's just say he's just one example. That $6 billion will not be not a tax exempt, but it would be tax deductible, which allows them essentially to evade being taxed on that particular amount. And it creates a means by which corporations can evade tax, but also money launder. So it's a very interesting model. It serves to sustain the status quo while simultaneously maximizing the profits of the donors in question.
Yeah. So war is a racket. And again, we come back to the beginning. about how these think tanks also sit at the nexus between all of these different special interests and the policy makers in Washington. So, yeah, it's a business model. They also, there's one thing I do want to say about the revolving door, where politicians go hold public office, and when they lose their seats or their term is finished, they go and wait out these think tanks, and then when a position opens up, they will go back into informing policy, and that policy will eventually also be informed by their former employer, because it's also a safety net for politicians. When they no longer have a job in Washington, they will have a cush, nice private sector job that they can always go back to. And this is just how that community works.
And I just wanted to add something that we forgot to mention, is that there's actually no legal obligation for the vast majority of these think tanks to actually disclose the vast majority of their donors. I mean, they do provide a certain list, but they provide lists, they provide the information that they want to provide. So there isn't a legal obligation for complete transparency. So they're essentially this deregulation allows them to monitor themselves and provide information, but that information is very controlled and sanitized. So the extent of the funding and the collaboration between the state and the private sector with these think tanks is probably even more than what the public actually knows because of the lack of transparency.
Right. And so in closing, though, I do want to say that not all think tanks are necessarily part of this system. Are there any that you would recommend to the audience if they wanted to start reading more in-depth news analysis than you would see in like ABC or the Associated Press or things like that?
There are some small think tanks. Like I really like the work of Transnational Institute, which is based in the Netherlands, and they're kind of my go-to whenever I really want to see some bona fide research by a Western think tank. There's also, I think, the
Quincy
Big Brother
Institute?
Watch. The Quincy Institute, Big Brother's Watch. I'm just trying to think. Corporate Observatory is a good one. But they're very small. They don't get the kind of funding, unfortunately, that these big think tanks get. But it's also why they actually provide much more neutral and genuine research. So these are some think tanks that I would really advocate people to look into, because their work and their research is very good.
All right, awesome. So yeah, we'll check those out. We'll put those think tanks in the description. So we hope that this has been informative for y'all. I've been wanting to do a piece on think tanks for a long time now. Alina, thank you so much for coming on. Hope to do it again sometime.
Yes, thank you. I would love to be back anytime, and it was a pleasure.
All right, thank you. And again, we're going to transition now to the Q&A section. So see you in a sec. All right, cool. Think tanks. It's a whole friggin' rabbit world. Okay, so what do we got, guys? Hope that was informative. Okay, first up, Bill Nye the Highest Guy. First of all, awesome name. Greg, what makes you think that this will end in a frozen conflict? Russia-Ukraine, that's what he's referring to. That's what we started at the beginning of the episode. So doesn't that imply that Ukraine... NATO in parentheses has the ability to stop the Russian advance? I haven't seen anything giving that impression. Well, first of all, it's going to come down to a war of attrition. You know, Ukraine, while having lost the initiative, and all signs point to the fact that they won't be, there's very real potential that they won't ever get it back, that no amount of counteroffensives will prevail. They still have a lot of drones, suicide drones, and munitions. So what the Russians are doing is working for Russia right now, and they don't want to lose a bunch of troops forcing a massive spearhead invasion. So the U.S. isn't going to back down. The U.S. doesn't look like it's going to allow Ukraine to back down, and Russia isn't going to take all that territory. Doesn't want a grinding war of attrition because it doesn't suit its foreign policy objectives. And yeah, I don't think the U.S. will ever agree to a ceasefire as long as things stand right now, because they'll look completely weak if they give ground here. No one's going to be scared of the threat of their proxy funding anymore. So as things stand right now, it looks like a frozen conflict where there's going to be no ceasefire. There's going to be maybe an armistice line and a demilitarized zone. And then they'll bring in the surveillance and the construction contractors to build that, and it'll make a lot of people a lot of money. But yeah, so that's just my hypothesis. So, okay. Wasn't there, Bill Nye also asked, the highest guy, wasn't there a Rand Corporation paper on how to strategically defeat Russia by destroying the Nord Stream and imposing sanctions? I think we referred to that one. Let me pull it back up real quick, y'all. It's this overextending and unbalancing Russia. I've never seen anything by the Rand Corporation or any think tank that would that said anything about blowing up the Nord Stream, but they did say, if we look here, this is that's the electoral interference that they were talking about. Okay, that's the military, that's economic. Where's the energy? Okay, here's the economic sanctions. Yeah. So increase Europe's ability to import oil from places other than Russia. So if you can't increase Europe's ability, you could, in theory, decrease Europe's ability to purchase gas and oil, and that's if the Nord Stream didn't exist anymore. I'm not making a comment on whether that was an inside job or not. I'm just saying that is one way to not have the Nord Stream pipeline function anymore, to stop Russian gas from going to Europe. But again, that's just a thing. But to circle back to your question, I have not seen any official literature from any of these think tanks saying explicitly blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. Alina, do you see a new Great Depression Weimar Republic in the USA? Russia, China is still trading with the US, but for how long? Is there a real danger the future BRICS summit will have sanctions on the West? Well, I wish Alina could be here to answer your question. But she lives in Cyprus, so it's now like really late, like 4 or something. Let me see. It's 7, so that's 3 plus 5. It's like 5 in the morning because 8 hours ahead of where I am right now in Texas. Yeah, so that was we had to pre-record that segment, so she can't be there to answer it. But I will say that in the future, the far future, all these things that are happening with BRICS will take time. The de-dollarization, all of their objectives, because of the inertia behind the Western unipolar hegemony, will take a long time to break. So, but sanctions could happen. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to happen. Okay, question. Is this a valid metaphor? Our politicians are interchangeable figureheads on the pirate ships of the corporatocracy empire. See, there's no one had any idea how whoever like when this democracy, when this system of government was being designed, nobody took into account, because they couldn't foresee it, the unassailable power of multinational corporations. How do you regulate them? How do you stop them from influencing government? You can't really, because politicians have multiple paymasters. They have to campaign, and that requires money, and they are beholden to people for their reelection campaigns. And that's not grassroots. I'm just average Joe sending $2 in the mail. No, that's larger donations, either from private individuals who have vested who generally sit on boards or have vested interests in corporations, because we live in the society, in the economic structure that we live in, and the politicians are beholden to those people. Absolutely. So, I mean, I do think they do have some sort of self-determination. Some, not much, because we're seeing what happens with AIPAC. So, to varying degrees, some politicians are better than ever, but like AOC, as much of like she can wear all the Eat the Rich shirts to the Met Gala that she wants, she is still scared of AIPAC, and she is still scared of special interests, clearly. So that's why she's had to moderate her speech about stuff. So even the biggest firebrand is still beholden to corporate interests, for sure. Also, Since the Ukrainian military is so depleted, how much longer can they hold out for? I'm actually have not been invested looking into any sort of I haven't had the time to look into any sort of projection figures for how long the Ukrainian military can last. It looks like indefinitely. That doesn't mean they'll retake ground. They could lose more ground, but I mean, they will not stop existing anytime soon. You know, they are trying to recruit people. There's 600,000 draftable men living in other countries. The Ukrainian government's trying to get those people back to draft them. Right now, you know, there's massive conscription happening, but like from older men, because all the younger men are either fled or dead or wounded. And so but just because that is true doesn't mean that they will completely be degraded to a 0% fighting capacity. So do you feel that RFK Jr. and Trump being against supporting the war against Russia because it's a compromise with the deep state is going to go after China? I don't know too much about Trump's. Well, I mean, we can look at his last presidency. Oh, so when Trump says things and it has to do with foreign policy, I don't believe it until it actually happens because he says a lot of wild stuff. So what he says today could change. He's very mutable, very fungible with his stances. So again, do you feel that RFK Jr. and Trump being against supporting the war against Russia is because it's a compromise with the deep state to go? Okay, no, I think Trump has legitimate sympathies with Putin. You know, Trump wants to be an authoritarian dude. You know, he's just said it. He wants like to go after his legal enemies and use the Justice Department as his own freaking. Sorry, I almost said a bad word. Against his political rivals. He definitely has authoritarian leanings. He looks up to people that are commonly considered dictators, and yeah, I mean, he wants to be one of them. And I think ingratiating himself to Putin and Russia is something that he did in his first presidency. And I think he will definitely pressure for an end to the war in Ukraine. He said yesterday that, you know, the second he gets into office, there's going to be a ceasefire. And then the Russian ambassador is like, he said there's going to be a ceasefire in a day. And and a bunch of Russian ministers are like, it's not going to take a day. It's going to take longer than a day. So he definitely does. He's probably going to want to end the war. It's just not going to happen immediately. And we don't know exactly what the situation on the ground is going to look like in November. Like, this is months in the future. A lot can happen in a month or 2 months, 3 months, especially when it comes to combat operations. So, all right, I think that is. Oh, we got a lot. Oh, we got one. How will climate change and the failure of the West to do something about it versus China affect geopolitics? China has its own climate issues, climate control issues. I don't think it's really going to affect anything. I think it's a fringe issue that not a lot of people are caring about. We care about it because we're more like politically and socially minded than most people. I don't think it's really going to affect American hard power at all, at least in the short term, or American soft power in the short term. I think what we're doing, supporting unconditionally genocide in Gaza, is going to be way more damaging. It is going to be like the greatest impact on geopolitics going forward. So thank you guys so much for watching. We're at the end of our time. I hope to see you Monday. So we might change this to Thursday if it's more convenient for y'all. I don't think I saw any comments saying like if you would prefer Thursday or Friday, but I think next week we're going to try Thursday at 7 p.m. to see if we have a higher engagement rate. So hopefully that works for y'all. We'll be looking for feedback and everything else. So hope you enjoyed this one. Have a great weekend if you can in this increasingly complicated and not so fun world. And we'll see you next week for more Isn't Life Grand material. So thank you guys so much for watching State of Play. Check you next time.